The Berlin Wall, more than any other symbol, helps to represent the struggles of the Cold War. The wall is so emblematic because it is a physical barrier, a wall separating the people of Berlin. On the west, people representing a free democratic idea, and on the east, a communist community who needed protection from corrupt capitalists and greedy opportunists. This is Mr. Trio, and today we are talking about why was the Berlin Wall built in 1961. For today's discussion, we're going to be talking about three central events along our timeline. The first is in 1961 when the Berlin Wall was constructed. The second is John F. Kennedy's famous speech in 1963 when he visited the city of Berlin, and then Ronald Reagan's speech decades later when he visited the city of Berlin in the year 1987. As we investigate this focus point, why was the Berlin Wall built in 1961, one of the things that I'd like to point out is that we are revisiting President Kennedy, who was a central character, of course, in the Cuban Missile Crisis in the previous chapter, and we will also be talking about President Ronald Reagan, who was President of the United States in the 1980s. He will reemerge later when we talk more about the Soviet reforms later on in this unit. Now, let's just have a brief review of Germany. As you may remember, Germany was held responsible for starting the First World War, and then they were also held responsible for starting the Second World War. So at the end of World War II, there were many people who felt like Germany was too dangerous to keep together. So in other instances that we've looked at, namely Korea and Vietnam, Germany was divided into two parts. Instead of being divided north and south, they were divided east and west. West Germany essentially becomes an ally to the United States, Great Britain, and France, and East Germany becomes allies to the Soviet Union. One of the anomalies about this separation, however, was the city of Berlin. Berlin was located in East Germany, but because it was the capital of Germany, it had sort of a unique status. So within East Germany, the city of Berlin was divided into four parts: Soviet part, French part, British part, and the American part. You may remember this from our previous unit. By the early 1960s, essentially, France, Great Britain, and the United States had consolidated their parts of Berlin into one, and the Soviets had their part. So essentially, Berlin was a city of two parts. On the west, allies to democratic governments in the United States, Great Britain, and France, and in the east, allied to the Soviet Union. Before we go further, one of the things that I'd like to talk about is this concept of what does a wall represent. And in many cases, this is often a point of view. And namely, it depends on what side of the wall you're standing on. For example, an argument could be made that there are dangers on the other side of the wall, and that on one side, you are using the wall as protection. The Soviets and the East Germans would argue that that was the purpose of the wall, to keep dangerous elements out of East Germany. The other point of view, of course, is that a wall is to keep you in, like a prisoner, and essentially the wall separates you from freedom. This is the point of view that the Americans and other Western democratic countries would say. So essentially, this is, in a nutshell, the concept of a physical barrier. Are you looking at this barrier as a way to keep people in, or are you trying to keep people out? The principal reason why the Berlin Wall was constructed in 1961 is because Germans in the East were leaving and heading to the West. So essentially, in order to understand the history of the Berlin Wall, we have to ask the question, why were people leaving? And essentially, it comes down to three principal areas. The first is socially, economically, and then politically. And we'll take a look at each of these individually. From a social point of view, one of the reasons why the wall was constructed is that East Germany, and East Berlin in particular, was experiencing what was known as a brain drain, meaning that all the young people and well-educated people were leaving for greater opportunities in the West. This kind of is a crossover with our geography topic, but if you're familiar with the concept of a population pyramid, what essentially was happening in 1950 in Germany is that middle section, which is your working population, was decreasing. And that by 1960, essentially, a smaller portion of people are working in East Germany, and a greater number of people are beyond the working age. So this is the belt, the economically active group, which essentially means that you have an older population. And without a younger population to help support them, this is a dramatic strain on a community. One of the things which is also very closely related is that from an economic point of view, the people who were leaving tended to be skilled workers, individuals that had some type of profession which was key to the growing of an economy. Construction workers, doctors, lawyers, teachers, support people like firemen, and to a lesser degree service industry people as well. From 1950 to 1960, the working age population dropped from 70% to 61%, which means that essentially that percentage of people were leaving. Now, sometimes population growths drop because of death rates, but in this particular case, it was because they were immigrating to new areas. Once again, one of the reasons why East Germany was concerned is that when you have that many people leaving, not only does it hurt the workforce and productivity, but it also means that they are not going to be having children in order to have the next generation of Germans. So it's sort of a twofold kind of problem for East Germany. Last but not least, one of the reasons why the wall was constructed is that it made communism look bad. Here's a great poster from 1953 showing the May Day celebration in Germany. Shows a happy couple in the forefront. In the back, you have your communist leaders like Marx and Stalin and Lenin. But in reality, East Germans look more like this, behind the fence wall. So essentially, one of the reasons why they wanted to construct this wall is they had to keep people in East Germany, otherwise it made it look like communism was not working. From a political point of view, it is also important to note that the United States and other Western countries took advantage of this situation by using the Berlin Wall as a symbol of oppression. Let's talk about two of the most important speeches made by American presidents specifically about the Berlin Wall. The first is from John F. Kennedy in June of 1963.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin.
John F. Kennedy's speech is a very important one in that it was made shortly after the construction of the wall. And Kennedy's speech is clearly trying to illustrate that there is a divide in which people on one side are free and on the other side they are imprisoned. Perhaps the second most important speech in Berlin that relates to this topic is when Ronald Reagan traveled to Berlin in 1987. In greater context, it's important to remember it was at this time that the Soviet Union was weak, and essentially there were a lot of reforms that were taking place in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev, who is referenced here, was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. Let's have a listen to what Mr. Reagan said about this symbol.
As long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Thank you for joining me during this video presentation of why was the Berlin Wall built in 1961, and I look forward to further discussions that we may have in class.